And without further ado, I'd like to welcome the two candidates who are here today with a round of applause. Chris and Gareth. Okay, before starting, I've been asked by all the different members of the Muslim Forum of Middlesex just to confirm Hannah David has not been able to make it. We have to just explain factually what has happened to make sure that it is clear that we have not excluded her for any reason. So we'll just explain what happened, and I'll just explain step by step. We started a conversation with her in September last year. She agreed to speak to us a few months later in January. The perception from the three people who met her in January was that she wasn't able to engage with us as well as we'd have liked. We requested a husting several months ago and at that meeting in January. After several weeks from the meeting in January, there had been no response in spite of several chasing emails. In front of William Hague and one of the members of the Muslim Forum of Middlesex, Hannah David agreed to come to a hustings. We got in touch with Hannah and requested her to propose a date. Her team asked us to propose dates instead, and we did so after talking about Gareth Thomas's availability. She did not respond about those dates, again in spite of chasing, until very late, when her team told me that she was not able to make it. After that, she told us that she may be able to make it if we change the time to accommodate her. We therefore changed the time to make it work. A few days ago, her team told me that she was not able to make it. So what we are going to do is, people are able to and can raise the views of any of the candidates, but she will not be able to answer the questions, obviously because she's not here. If you would like to see her views, you will be able to do so, and do so by looking online at muslimforums.co.uk/Middlesex. There you'll be able to see the views that she has given to us. Okay, without further ado, how is this going to work? What we're going to do is we have four main sections. We'll start off talking about public services, education and health. Then the economy, that's including inequality, social justice, austerity, etc. Then Islamophobia, then foreign policy, then any other questions that anyone has in the audience. I don't want to restrict you, so please feel free to raise anything at that stage. Again, I would like to remind you, this is a Muslim religious centre. Please do ensure that you conduct yourselves with the appropriate, in the appropriate way. And on the screen on both sides, you will be able to see any tweets that have hashtag Harrow Hustings on them. When we go to each section, we will also have a summary of all the key types of questions which are on the questionnaire, so that if you would like to check those out from Hannah David, you will be able to do so online. So, without further ado, let's start. We'd like our first question to be about education. And let's start with Abdulaziz. Is there a mic? Can we just have a mic passed around, please? Can we have a mic passed to Abdulaziz Kilani? In the front here.
Yeah, we all know that Nick broke his promise on the tuition fees. If he couldn't keep a promise to the students, how can we trust him to keep a promise to the entire country?
Well, we'll start with Chris Noyce, given that is a question today.
I think the whole point about the pledge to students made in 2010 was, I think Nick Clegg apologised for it, and I think that basically everyone's learnt a lot since then. But the history of it is actually quite important. The organisations that signed up the pledge not to bring in student fees, they extracted the promise from the Little Brats, and they extracted a promise from all the candidates at the time, whether they got elected or weren't. But the important thing is the background. And you must remember that the background was one caused by the fact that the previous Labour government was knowing that there was going to be a problem in funding student fees, and the report didn't come out in time for the election. It came in after the election. And so pretty much, I think it's a well-accepted fact that whichever party was in office would have had to deal with this problem. Now, I think that Nick Clegg was unfortunately made a rash promise that he couldn't have kept in the event of as events turned out. I personally believe that he was right to say that he didn't like student fees, because I don't think anyone does. And certainly any incoming administration must look at it and try and see if there's a way around it.
Just going back to the question itself, how can we be sure that any of the promises that he makes now are necessarily applicable in the future in the same way?
I think what you're trying to get is a understanding that he, I think, has learned from that event 5 years ago. I think it's very clear that promises made by him and anyone else will be binding, and certainly any promises that I make today will be binding. It remains to be seen as to whether we're in a position of influence or not.
Yeah.
First of all, can I say to Mr. Mubarak and the other trustees of the Sri Lankan Mosque, thank you very much for allowing us to come here. I should say particular thanks, Mr. Mubarak, for allowing me to come up here. I've been to the mosque many times, but never been allowed up to the senior rooms before now. I've had the privilege of being on Newsnight, but Jeremy Paxman is not as intimidating as the Muslim Forum of Middlesex, and just let me leave it at that. On the specifics of the question, I think there is a huge divide on education between the political parties, both on higher education and funding for education more generally. On higher education, we have said that we will reduce tuition fees to £6,000. I led the opposition to the decision of Nick Clegg and David Cameron to put tuition fees up to £9,000. And it is striking that both David Cameron and Nick Clegg have refused to rule out an increase in tuition fees above £9,000. And why does that matter? It matters because a number of universities are pushing for tuition fees to be increased as opposed to lowered after the next election. We have been very clear in our manifesto. We've said that we will lower them to 6,000, but both the Conservatives and the Liberals have pledged to keep tuition fees at £9,000, and indeed have refused to rule out an increase beyond that. The last thing I'd say, just on education more generally, is I have a three-month-old daughter, and I want her to go to school in well-funded state schools. And I worry that actually, if the Conservatives get back in, that there'll actually be a 10% cut in the funding for our schools, 11 to 18s will see just a cap on funding for schools at current levels. And independent forecasters estimate that inflation will be about 10% over the next 5 years. So that will be a cut in real terms to school budgets, as well as the potentially higher tuition fees if you vote for the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats.
We have about 330,000 Muslims across the country in full-time education, and 8% of school children are Muslim. It's clearly an important issue for the community. Are there any other questions from the audience about education? Front row again. Just if you could look at the next screen, if you can go to the screen, you'll be able to see the questions that I know that Hannah's not here. So if you just go to the next screen. Yeah, if you go to the next page. Those questions are the questions that are available on our website, answered by Gareth Thomas and Hannah David, if you'd like to find out. So just look at those, and we'll keep that there for a little bit.
Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Hamza Sagir here. I'm a community activist and also on the board of trustees of the school opposite, Heathland Whitefriars Academy. My question is, just 2 days ago for the Harrow, the primary school allocations were given out and it was 12% oversubscribed. So a very specific question, would the candidates here be supporting a free Muslim school in the locality here? And also secondary, it's very much related to the point of where, as part of the CTS bill, there's a huge amount of pressure that's coming down onto the teachers when they should be educating our children. Instead, now they're going to be looking and almost monitoring their thoughts to say whether they're being radicalized or not from the age of 3 onwards. So it's almost a case of, I'm thinking, should I be teaching my kid the difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim, that he may well go to school and be asked by the teacher and says, look, why are you making a distinction between a Muslim and a non-Muslim at the age of 3? And they may think that he's actually at risk of radicalization.
Yeah.
Well, listen, on free schools, I'm not a huge fan of free schools, I've got to be honest with you. I worry about the number of unqualified teachers in free schools across the country, and the lack of supervision and accountability of the current structure around free schools. I have a different view on faith schools, and recognise that if there is a demand from the Muslim community for a Muslim state school, a Muslim faith school, then that absolutely needs to be looked at. And obviously, if the basic criteria of the sort of quality of the school and the sensible curriculum, etc., can be met, as I'm sure it could be, then why shouldn't there be a Muslim faith school?
You would support it?
I would support it, as I say, with the caveat of I want to be convinced about the curriculum, and I want to be in the same way I would be about any faith school, and I want it to be actively involved in the community. I want there to be good teachers, etc. If those caveats are met, then absolutely, why not?
So are those caveats appropriate and ones that you make for any school you support at the moment, even today?
Absolutely. For every school, you should have those caveats, and for any new school, state school, faith school. As I say, I'm not a fan of free schools, but for free schools, those caveats should be there. And I think there's a more general point though about the importance of spreading understanding about Islam, and that's a challenge that I think needs to be achieved by all schools, regardless of whether there is a Muslim faith school in Harrow or the surrounding area. My first, I was a teacher before I got elected as a Member of Parliament, and had to teach religious education without any training. And that's when I discovered about the Hajj, for example. So there should have been better training for me when I was a teacher to be able to teach religious education across the piece. And I want my daughter, when she goes to school, to be taught about Islam in the same way I want her to be taught about Hinduism and other religions. And I think that's something that we've got to think through and get right at school level, helping people to understand and not be frightened of or intimidated by or think it's somehow odd that there is a strong Muslim community. And so that's an issue not just for, you don't solve that by having a Muslim school, you sort that out by making sure there's proper training for those who are going to teach religious education across every school.
We'll come to CTS later.
Okay. I've never been a fan of the free schools that have come in over the past 5 years. If there was a case made for a Muslim state school, I would be happy to support it, subject to the caveats which would apply in the case of any faith school that Gareth has outlined, and I think that is basically something that I would support, especially if it was driven by the community.
Thank you. Following on from that, we've had quite a few concerns brought in previously about Islamophobia within schools itself. There was an individual who teaches in Harrow, and he told me that one of the children went to his father and said, "You've got a beard, are you a terrorist?" This kind of behaviour obviously is being taught or being fomented or spreading within some schools. And the fact that Childline has said there's been a 60% increase in racist bullying, or calls due to racist bullying, mainly to do with Islamophobia, is a dangerous concern. With what you just said, how would you deal with that, and why haven't you dealt with it so far?
Well, I think of the beard that Frank Dobson has. Even though he's a West Ham fan, I think it'll be difficult to accuse him of being a terrorist. I mean, I come back to the original point. I think if there is, you need to teach children from a young age to be comfortable with the diversity that we have in London and across the UK more generally, and understanding why we have our differences of faith, of creed, of colour, etc., is hugely important. And as part of that, helping to teach people about the different faiths that we have in our communities, I think is one crucial way of helping to prevent Islamophobia in general terms. I think the other thing that we can do is to try and make it clear that Islamophobia isn't acceptable. And that's where people like Chris and I, as politicians, have the responsibility to speak out when there are obvious examples of Islamophobia that we're not comfortable with. And it's important that other faith organisations speak out when they're not happy with Islamophobia. And to be fair, I think that's one of the good things about the other faith communities in Harrow, that on occasion they have stood with the Muslim community. I think of the threat of the EDL marching against Harrow Central Mosque. There was support from the Jewish community, there was support from the Christian community, there was support from the Hindu community, and I think that's a great testimony to the support that the Muslim community in Harrow has from the other faith communities, and long may that stay the same. But Islamophobia is with us. We have to continue to confront it. It's a job for people like me, but it's also something that we need to tackle by making sure that Islam is taught and understood in religious education better in schools.
So you would specifically, if there is an issue, you would raise it. If there was an issue within the school, you would be happy to help support any action that needs to be taken against it?
I hope so, yes.
Thank you. Chris, this has grown under a coalition government of which you're a part, or your party is a part of. What do you think should be done, and why is it not being done already?
I think that I should make a statement that Islamophobia is wrong. Attacks on any community are also wrong. And if it's something that a Member of Parliament should get involved in, then a Member of Parliament should step in. You suggest that because I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats, I'm a supporter of the coalition government. Perhaps that is not quite the case. The coalition government was something that we ended up with at the end of the last election. It was not something I foresaw, but it's something we've had to live with for the past 5 years. And I should point out, although this has nothing to do with education, that the coalition government has proved to be relatively stable. A lot of people predicted it would burn out in a matter of months, and here we are, 5 years later, it's still there. I think that a lot of what you're suggesting, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps not entirely the case. I think that all that Parliament can do is lay down a legislative framework, and that's what it's tried to do. If that legislative framework has proved to be inadequate, then we must look at it again.
We'll look at Islamophobia later. I think we need to get some questions from the audience in. Let's go into, are there any questions on health? I mean, with the Muslim population younger than the overall population, we still have in 20 years about 300,000 Muslims within the age group of 70 to 94. And current stats from the Muslim Council of Britain and the British Muslims in Numbers report says that just looking at those who are over 65, ill health affects Muslims more than the overall population. So with an aging population, this is a dangerous and a worrying statistic. So any questions on health that people would like to raise?
I still have one on education. Sorry.
Or you can bring on education. There is a mic which is passed around. Just raise put your hand. If you put your hand up, I will choose someone from the audience. Yeah. So there's someone on that side, and we'll come from the ladies first, and we'll come to the brothers second.
Yeah, right here.
Start with the ladies' side. Yeah, please.
Right here. Yeah, no, ladies first. Oh, sorry, ladies.
I just wanted to ask the candidates we have here today, why the current coalition, you call it a coalition, I could call it something else, but why the current coalition government have allowed for unqualified teachers to teach a generation of children in free schools? Why have they allowed this to happen?
Chris as the coalition
Oh, well.
spokesman.
I don't think I'm the coalition spokesperson because I don't think David Cameron would like anything that I have to say. Free schools are quite clearly something that are enshrined in statute, but they come from a particular faction of the Conservative Party, a faction which I don't have any time for. I personally think that any school that's set up should have qualified teachers. That applies in the state sector, and it should also apply. We're going to have free schools for a while anyway. I think that it also should apply in the free school sector. I think that anyone that Mr. Cameron wants to educate his children of anyone that attends a free school, basically, I think it's a mistake of the system. And personally, I'd go for rescinding the free schools altogether if it was up to me. But obviously, there we are.
Short answer.
I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm not in the coalition. I'm opposed to it. As someone who was a trained teacher, I think it was right that there was a qualification I had to get, and that there was a period when I had to be supervised in schools, and I think we need to bring that back. There's been a senior Liberal Democrat in the Department for Education, David Laws, who could have vetoed the requirement that unqualified teachers could be appointed, but he chose not to do so.
Chris, do you want to get back on that?
I'll respond. I mean, the point is, remember, you're electing a parliament, a member of parliament for this constituency, and his or her views matter. I will not have any truck with free schools. I don't mind or care what the rest of the party decides. And if David Laws wants to make or doesn't want to lay down decrees on that sort of thing, then I think he's made a foolish mistake.
Okay, so just to add on this directly, if you were to be the Member of Parliament, would you risk your potential future cabinet career by voting against the Parliament and the whip?
Come on, come on, get serious. What potential future cabinet career does a 57-year-old lawyer?
Gareth, I guess that same question would apply to you. Future cabinet career as an aspiring future cabinet minister, would you be willing to vote against the party and the whip if there was a question on something that you felt strongly about? Yes. Constituents raised them to you?
Yes, I would be willing to, if necessary, to vote against the party line if it was something that I thought matters hugely to Harrow. You're elected as a member of Parliament for a constituency, and I've always thought that you have to be willing to stand up for that constituency. There are also certain issues of conscience that I would be willing to defy the party whip on. I've always felt very strongly, for example, that it was right that we didn't have the death penalty in the UK, and that would be something that I would be willing to defend, if necessary, by resignation, if that was what was required.
Member in the back.
As a childcare provider, I just wanted to know, we obviously get a 15 hours free funding for the students. And I know that you guys said you want to raise it to 25 or 30 hours, which was part of the manifesto. But would you guys consider raising the hourly rate as well? Because even if you do double the hours that the parents do get free childcare, the hourly rate is still quite small. And a lot of childcare do struggle with the hourly rate. Because it's not in line with the other rates of private daycare centres. It's hard to manage.
And well, we've said, as you're quite right, we've said we will increase the amount of free childcare to 25 hours a week, and we have costed that out. We've also said that we want to see an increase in the minimum wage and the promotion of the living wage. Now it will take us some time to get to that point, and I wouldn't want to give you a commitment now that on May the 8th you will see a rise in the cost that you're referring to. I can't give you that commitment. We haven't committed to that, but we are serious about wanting to increase low pay. And low pay is an issue which is endemic in the care sector, and it's something that we recognise has got to be addressed. But we need to do that in a way that is affordable for the country, which is why we've pledged to increase the minimum wage to £8 an hour by 2019, to give the country as a whole the chance to prepare for that increase in costs.
Sorry, directly on that, you said increasing the cost, the minimum wage to £8, but then private nurseries have to still provide the education for the children, and their costs will go up, but the rate that you need to provide them will stay the same. Is that correct? And the current situation?
Well, we've made a commitment to bring in the 25 hours childcare as soon as possible after the election of a Labour government. Our pledge on the minimum wage, we've been clear, is something that we would want to work to bring forward by 2019, that it would get up to £8 an hour. We also want to look at potentially giving tax incentives for businesses who pay the living wage. So that might help private nursery providers with some of those costs. What we want to avoid is a situation where businesses, childcare businesses, for example, go out of business because of costs. That wouldn't help anybody. But we have got to tackle the low pay crisis in this country. 2/3 of the jobs that are being created since 2010 are jobs that pay less than the living wage. Now that's an unacceptable situation, and we've got to tackle that. But we've got to do that in a graduated, measured way, which helps businesses to adjust to paying a decent level of income in a way which doesn't stop those businesses, doesn't mean that those businesses get into financial trouble.
Chris?
It's quite interesting that the sector of childcare is generally unregulated right up to, well, it's regulated in Ofsted, but essentially it's a private enterprise up to the age of 5 or so when children start school, and they're hopefully educated in schools maintained by local authorities that have certain standards. I've always thought that although Ofsted does have a supervisory role in that, I've always thought that the number of nurseries that pop up here, there and everywhere, they are in response to a demand, but they are essentially almost a sort of a wild, they're almost wild card being played, and I think they should be much more better regulated. Now, as far as the wages, I know that the Labour Party is very keen on introducing the increase in the living wage, as he says, but I think that there is a risk that if you prescribe requirements, you will actually end up with stifling possible enterprise when you do have to have contracts to meet every situation.
That seems to be slightly different to the manifesto pledged by the Liberal Democrats, who say we will pay this living wage in all central government departments and their agencies from April 2016. Do you have a different view to the party?
Well, you notice that it says central government departments and agencies, which is not the same as the entire spectrum of employment in this country. So I think that's a distinction that you've made very satisfactorily.
Good answer. Okay. We've been starting to talk about the economy a bit. I would like to broaden. Everyone can ask questions on education, health, or the economy. Just worth noting that 90% of Muslims self-identify as a black minority ethnic community. So many of the issues that affect the minority community affect the Muslim community in particular. We have great unemployment of more than 20% of Muslims between the ages of 16 and 74 haven't worked before, compared to 4% of the population overall. So a big concern here. But at the same time, we shouldn't really think only negatively about the Muslim community. The Muslim Pound report by the NCB has shown that £31 billion is the impact of the Muslim community in the UK. So we have a good chance here to make a big difference. Any questions on the audience on the economy, health, or education? I think firstly we'll start over here and we'll move on. Question at the front here?
My name is Afsar Ahmed from South Harrow. We have heard so many times, education, education, education. It looks like a pop song. But it's only a song, but in practice, I have learned that the uneducated teachers or unqualified teachers are teaching our children. So what will be the future of our children? So the main thing is that instead of fighting in Iraq or Libya, they should spend the money in England, in our country, so that the children benefit from that and don't waste the money. Britain is a rich country, but half of the money is going outside. They are giving charity to India, while India is making the atom bomb and missiles. So the wrong policy, wrong work. The second thing is that our young Prime Minister has said that I will help pensioners. But when we go to the council, they say we are having cuts. So I don't know who to believe.
Good question. Let's just get some more views from the audience. We'll ask the questions together. I think there's a question here. Anyone else? Please put your hands up if you have a question. A question from the ladies' side actually we'll ask first, and then we'll move to the gents' side.
My question goes back to the two questions actually, the chairman allowed. One is to do with the areas funding that we discussed.
Please be quick though.
Yes, quick, but just the fact that if you're going to increase it to 75 hours, or we've got 30 hours a week, if the hourly rate doesn't meet the cost of the businesses that provide this care, and let's face it, statutory government agencies cannot meet the supply that is required or the demand that is there to be met without the tax providers. So how are you going to propose to ensure that this business is supported well enough? And my second question comes about being a benefit advisor and the current welfare system and the new benefits that are proposed or that are already in place. So what are you going to do about the bedroom tax and how are you going to change that if you're elected?
Bedroom tax, good. There's one question further, and we'll start asking the...
Regarding education, as ethnic minority,
Can you switch the mic on, please, if you can?
closer. Yes. As an ethnic minority, in Somali community, we used to have 3 Somali teachers. The 3 of them all lost their jobs. But now, unqualified teachers are easy to hire. And that resulted children, instead of going to university, going to prison. Is there any change?
Yeah, you've got 3 questions. So.
Okay, let me try and answer those questions. As I say, sir, you asked who to trust. Don't mind David Cameron, you trust me. Stick with me, that's what I would say to you. On unqualified teachers, I've made my position clear. I think teachers should be trained. I think we should try and make it easier for people to come into the teaching profession at different stages in their working lives. So it should just be 21-year-olds fresh out of university, as I was, staying on and doing a postgraduate qualification and then 2 years sort of probation. Although that is an important route. But people perhaps who've worked in science or business or in other professions, they should be helped to perhaps convert to be a teacher and bring their experiences into the classroom. As someone who was a minister in the Department for International Aid and had responsibility for our aid program to India, I don't agree with you that we shouldn't, as a country, as one of the richest countries in the world. I think we do have a responsibility to help get aid to the poorest people in the world. I agree with you that India has a responsibility to look after its own citizens. Every country does. But I'm proud of the difference that we made in basic education, for example, in India, but also in countries like Pakistan and a number of African countries like Ghana too. We're strongly committed to 0.7% of Britain's national income being spent on tackling poverty overseas. I think that's the right thing to do for a country of our size and importance. Well, we're now withdrawing, Britain as a country is now withdrawing from giving aid to India. But I would say to you, sir, that there are still plenty of other countries around the world where we should be giving aid in the future. And so I hope you'll trust me on that question. On the bedroom tax, we would abolish the bedroom tax. We opposed the introduction of the bedroom tax and have voted a number of times. I've voted in the House of Commons a number of times for its abolition. Seen people in my surgery who are victims, effectively, of the bedroom tax and are facing the prospect of having to move out of Harrow as a result. The gentleman there was asking about a number of Somali teachers who lost their jobs. I mean, what I would say on that is, I mean, we, in the same way that our schools reflect the diversity of our country, so the teaching profession needs to reflect the diversity of our country too. And we need to make sure that people from every community have the confidence to come forward and be trained to be teachers and then to get jobs in state schools and beyond. And so I don't know the specifics of the case that you've mentioned, but if it's to do with schools in Harrow West, then I'll be very keen to have a conversation with you in the future about that.
Chris.
Well, a whole raft of questions have been raised, but I'll start, if I may, with the gentleman sitting next to Councillor Ali in the front row. Basically, I would be opposed to foreign adventures, which are costly and prove extremely difficult to extract yourself from as a country. I mean, one of the problems is that Britain's involvement in the Middle East, or aspects of this, goes back to the effect of the previous leader of the Labour Party, Bar One, who was very good at getting involved into foreign adventures, and although it's 12 years ago, the party was opposed to intervention in Iraq then, and as a concept remains opposed to intervention in Iraq now and anywhere else.
Yeah, we'll come to foreign affairs later, so let's focus on the other questions.
Okay. The other question that you raised, or somebody raised, was aid to India. And it does seem that India is a country of considerable contrast, because there are still, although there may be a few billionaires at the top, there are an awful lot of extremely poor people at the bottom, and a lot more poor people than there are billionaires. So I don't really think that withdrawing the aid to India would necessarily result in what you want. I also think that there are other countries who are suffering in poverty throughout the world, and we should have an aid programme to them.
Don't send them money, give them the aid
Sorry, yeah.
to the right people, not to the
Yeah,
government.
aid, yes. I said aid.
Okay, great. Bedroom tax? Given that was something that the Liberal Democrats were part of in the coalition.
You're going to spend all your time bringing up the coalition government, aren't you? Again, I mean, personally, I think that I personally would stand opposed to the bedroom tax or anything else. You'll appreciate that when you're electing an MP, you're electing an MP who is going to vote according to his or her conscience. And I personally would not particularly like to see some of these effects of austerity generally. And as I've alluded to before, I've got absolutely no chance of a cabinet career if I was ever elected.
Okay, question from the back there. I think we'll take a couple more questions before we move on to the next topic. From the back there, any questions from the ladies' side? From someone who hasn't asked already? No?
Good afternoon to the panel, and this is a question relating to the NHS. I've spent the last 13 years working in the NHS outside of Harrow, and more recently at a senior management level. Standards where I've worked have been very high and the hospital management very progressive. In Harrow, Norfolk Park has been merged with 2 other reported failing trusts. And the provision of care individually, in my view and experience, has always been third class from the patient perspective. How will you address this with the management of the new hospital trust if elected, and how can we hold you to account for this?
I suppose there are a number of parts to my answer, sir, if I may. I mean, my daughter was born in Northwick Park in January, and the quality of the care that was provided by the surgeon and his team when my baby was being delivered was absolutely first class. If I'm honest with you, the care on the postnatal ward that my partner experienced was not of the same standard. And I think there's a real challenge in the NHS, particularly around postnatal care. But at Northwick Park, I think we don't have enough beds. We don't have, as a result, enough nurses and doctors to meet the needs of the population in the area. The management of Northwick Park in January 2014 said that we needed an extra 123 beds to meet the current level of demand in our area. And only 40 of those extra beds have been provided. So I think the key task for me, if I'm re-elected, is to campaign for that extra investment in Northwick Park, so that demand for those extra 83 beds is met and provided, and those extra doctors and nurses are recruited to manage that. There's a new chief executive in place now at North West London Hospitals Trust that covers Central Middlesex, Ealing and Northwick Park. And I see my job as supporting him in pushing for that extra investment, but also when people come to me with examples of poor care, of challenging him on that poor care. How can you hold me to account? Well, you can come and see me in my surgery if you live in my constituency and demand that I take action. You can write to me or email me, and I'll be very happy to take those cases up.
Can I just pick up on your point?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
About beds. Most trusts across the country have got pressure to reduce beds in hospital. So I think asking to increase the number of beds is not going to be reality. It's actually going to be the opposite. Chief executive officers have got a real pressure on them to reduce the number of beds and to turn patients around the A&E and send them back into primary care. So I think increasing the number of beds is not what's going to happen in reality.
Well, I take your point that there's been pressure for a number of years to try and reduce the number of beds and to speed up the turnaround in people coming through the doors of the hospital. It's not me setting the target in terms of the beds. It's the hospital management saying that they need an extra 123 beds. They say that they've discussed the situation with NHS England, and that NHS England accepts that 123 extra beds are needed. So I think it's my job to challenge NHS England on whether they still support that figure and to get those extra doctors and nurses. I suppose the one other thing to say, which perhaps links back to the issue of care more generally, is that we need to try and integrate the health service and social care sectors more effectively than we have done up to now. And what we've said is we would create what's called a time to care fund, funded by a mansion tax and a levy on cigarette manufacturers, to pay for more doctors, nurses and home care workers, to try and tackle both the crisis in our health service and the crisis in social care.
So just directly on that, obviously funding is a key part of getting more beds, but you said that the money that has been allocated, I think it's 2.5 billion by the Labour Party, the manifesto, is focused on frontline staff. Does that mean that there will not be extra funding for more beds in different areas? So would there be a difference between the Conservative Party, or the coalition, sorry, in play at the moment when it comes to NHS England and the number of beds that are allocated down? Or would it be something that you would be able to, if Labour comes into power, fund and really make there be enough funding to make it happen?
Well, as I say, we've pledged how we would pay for those extra doctors and nurses that we've committed to. It's a fully costed plan, and similarly with the home care workers. I mean, my job, if I'm re-elected as the Harrow West MP, is to make sure that Harrow gets its fair share of that extra funding, and I want to make sure there's extra funding for Northwick Park. I'd also want to make sure that there's extra funding for the walk-in centres, such as at Alexandra Avenue, which do so much to lift some of the pressure on the accident and emergency departments and local GPs. So, you know, the health service is getting more money into Harrow's health service is the top commitment that I've made if I'm re-elected, and I fully expect people in this room and outside to hold me to account on that.
Right. The question raised a lot of issues, so I'll start and continue the way I mean to. First of all, holding an MP to account. That's the right of every one of you who are constituents of Harrow West in this room. An MP should be available, and you can contact him by email, by letter, and his job is to take up that issue.
Or her job.
Or her job, sorry. Or her job, potentially. Is to take up that issue. And that, I think, is how you hold MPs to account. You can also come and see them at the surgery whenever you like. I've been a councillor for 25 years. Actually, it will be 25 years on polling day. And I simply say, contact me on the phone, my phone number. In fact, some constituents of my ward actually have my office phone, and they regularly phone me up, much to everyone else's annoyance. So that's taking into account. I mean, part of our manifesto, which was issued on Wednesday morning, we said we would fully fund the amount that the head of the English NHS said is required. And that is a pledge. And obviously, if you just start talking about that sort of money being injected in the system, that will get rid of a lot of the problems. I mean, personally, I think that Northwick Park is a very good hospital, and I would like to see it constructively criticised, but I think it is open to constructive criticism because it doesn't get everything right, and I know that from personal experience.
So directly on that, the Chief Executive of NHS England has said there's an 8 billion funding gap. Labour are willing to put in 2.5 billion. What's going to happen with the remaining 5.5?
So he I think, has talked about a funding gap of £8 billion by 2020. We think there's an immediate funding crisis, and that's where our Time to Care fund kicks in. We think, for example, we need an extra 20,000 nurses, an extra 5,000 home care workers, and our Time to Care fund will pay for that. Obviously, as we get further in, we'll look to use budget rounds each year to put more investment into the health service. But what we're pledged to do is to try and address the immediate funding needs of the NHS, and we would create a levy on properties over £2 million, a so-called mansion tax, and a levy on cigarette manufacturers to pay for that extra investment now.
Thank you very much. I think what we're going to do is we're going to move on to Islamophobia just because of time pressure. Right now we have a situation where 40% of the British population would vote or would support policies that would decrease the number of Muslims in the UK. 40% of the British population, according to a poll, would support policies to reduce the number of Muslims in the UK. That's how far Islamophobia has spread and become socially acceptable. 55% would be bothered by the prospect of a mosque being built in their area, and people think that like 17% of Muslims, 17% of the population in the UK is Muslims, when it's actually 5%. 90% of media coverage when it comes to Muslims is negative, and when it comes to representation, we only have 8 Muslim MPs compared to an expectation of over 30. What has happened in the past few years when it comes to Islamophobia? A cross-party working group has been set up, but Chris Allen, one of the key parts of this, the expert, has actually left due to a lack of funding and the government's shared inability to move forward and tackle Islamophobia, according to Chris Allen. So we have a question of Islamophobia growing, with a Muslim being attacked every day, with a mosque and a cemetery being attacked every couple of weeks, and that's only to do with reported cases. With that in mind, what would the panelists do, and what is the panelists' view on what should be done to combat Islamophobia?
If the present statutory provisions to prevent race hatred are inadequate, they should be strengthened. Also, I think one of the things which perhaps the bulk of the population could look at is the shining example of Harrow, which is one of the most ethnically, religiously, culturally diverse boroughs, not in London, but in the entire country. And I think that in the event that some people from outside of Harrow looked in, they would actually see that there's a lot to be gained by a mixed, or culturally mixed community. And I'm very proud to continue to live in Harrow, because I happen to believe that that's the way that we should go forward in the future. Many people from Harrow, from the English ethnic group, have left Harrow. They've gone everywhere else. But I don't intend to do that. At least I didn't intend to do it voluntarily. I believe that a lot of what could happen in Harrow has been proved to be very good, and that I don't think there are huge examples of the sort of problems that you get elsewhere. The sort of where you get your statistics from is you aggregate the country as a whole, and you look at those areas where most people have not seen anyone from ethnic minorities whatsoever. And it's quite clear that from even members of the staff at the office, I know that from those that live out of Greater London, they have a bias, they have a view that's very different to people that live in Greater London.
Just to note on that, a colleague of ours from the Muslim Forum of Middlesex, actually on the way back from work on the Jubilee line, was threatened. She was wearing a headscarf and she was threatened like that, and she found it quite difficult to even report it, because she was very disappointed that nobody came and supported her. So this is, I think, an issue that does affect people here as well.
Well, that's very unfortunate, and I would hope that those incidents are very few and far between.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true that we, in general, have very good relationships across Harrow, but I don't think we can be complacent about Islamophobia in Harrow. And with the number of cuts in police in Harrow, we're seeing younger, less experienced officers being directed into Harrow. And we've got a very good borough commander, but we need to make sure that our police have the resources they need to take action when there are hate crimes against Muslims or hate crimes, frankly, against people of other faiths as well. And so that's, I think, a challenge for the Metropolitan Police, and that's a challenge for London in particular. But I come back to essentially where we started off on, and that's around schools. If we're going to have a serious program to tackle Islamophobia, then we've got to start with a serious strategy in schools to help people to understand Islam and to understand what being a member of the Muslim community means, and a cross-departmental strategy to help make sure we have a campaign against Islamophobia is essential. We would bring that in.
Okay, I'd like to get some questions and some comments from the audience, so if you could just raise your hands if you'd like to make a comment. I'm going to start with those who haven't made one so far, if that's okay, and then we'll come back to those who have. So if you could just raise your hands if you haven't made one so far. The front, these two individuals, and I think there's someone called Abdul Rahman. Yes, let's start. We can start with Abdul Rahman and then move across there. Hafiz. Hafiz means he knows the whole of the Quran off by heart.
And do you think that more education is needed within schools and the media to tackle and combat Islamophobia?
Great, thank you. We'll just get a couple more questions in because I think we've got these two over here.
Oh, thank you. So it's all well and good to say that Islamophobia is wrong, but we want to see something tangible. Just like how rightly racial crime against people of colour is a hate crime, and anti-Semitism is a hate crime, would we get a pledge from you to support a policy where Islamophobia is recorded officially by the Metropolitan Police as an official category of hate crime?
I was just going to echo what my colleague over here said. I just found it's clear from both your responses that you were obviously naturally against and totally opposed to anything that would lead to Islamophobia. However, what struck me is that in both of your replies, you said your answer was focused and concentrated on Harrow. You said we haven't seen much Islamophobia in Harrow. Well, for a start, most of us travel outside Harrow as well. And secondly, if this was a question of racism, or homophobia, or anti-Semitism, we'd never think for a moment to say, well, actually, it's okay in Harrow. It's an issue. Islamophobia anywhere in the UK should be a problem for all of us. So I just found it a bit struck by the fact you were focusing so on Harrow. I appreciate we are running as PPCs for Harrow, but I'd like to see a concern for yourselves in terms of legislation for throughout the UK.
So,
So just let them answer questions first, and then we'll come back.
So what we have specifically said is not so much new legislation is needed to tackle Islamophobia as such, but new guidelines to magistrates and judges are required, so that where there are examples of Islamophobia, they are counted in the same way as racist hate crimes. The technical term is aggregated offences. And particularly if there are repeat offenders, that in that way they can be dealt with in a more effective manner than is currently happening at the moment. And that is for not just for Harrow, sir. I take the criticism, but for in London and nationally. The gentleman on my left, you said that there needs to be more work to tackle Islamophobia in schools. Absolutely. I mean, I go back to my own experience as a teacher before I was elected, when I had to do my own research about Islam, which was a bit ridiculous a sense there should have been proper training for me as someone who was going to have to teach religious education, so that I taught it in a proper way. I like to think I got there in the end, but I think if you're going to tackle the problem of Islamophobia, then you've got to have a much more serious strategy than just leaving it up to individual teachers. And so we would want to make the resources available to have cross-government, a strategy that works in schools, but also in other areas too, to tackle Islamophobia.
So can I just come back to that just very, very quickly?
Yeah.
Simply to say that I hear what you said in terms of legislation not being needed to move as far as you're aware.
But,
correct. Since the legislation came in, I think in 2006, regarding religiously motivated hate crimes, I don't think there's been a single one in terms of Islamophobia since 2006. So do you not think it needs to be brought on parity with, let's say, race-related hate crimes?
I do. I mean, it's interesting that you're acknowledging that there is legislation in place. The question is that legislation being used?
It's not working clearly.
And what you're saying is it's not being used
If it's not working, I'm saying to you, it's a stain on our civilization.
Yeah. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying that I think it's not new legislation that's being required. It's about the implementation of that existing legislation. And if you have as part of a strategy to tackle Islamophobia, we need to look at how the people are going to enforce action against people who are being Islamophobic is taken. And that may mean we need more training for police officers and the Crown Prosecution Service to deal with existing incidents that happen that are Islamophobic. But we also need to try and stop Islamophobia from happening in the first place, and that's where the reference to work in schools is so important.
Okay, so your Labour Party manifesto, the Black Minority Ethnic manifesto that came out, said that you would develop a cross-government strategy on hate crime from schools to social media to tackle the growth in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which is quite powerful. The Liberal Democrat one similarly said that they would work closely with faith and community organisations, such as including the Muslim Council of Britain, to prevent hate crime, including at places of worship. And they're determined to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate in the UK and internationally. So it looks there is some sort of agreement on that. But would you, like the Liberal Democrat BME manifesto, pledge to work with Muslims across the UK, including the Muslim Council of Britain, to prevent hate crime in this way?
Well, I'd even be willing to work with Liberal Democrats on this. It's an issue that we've got to get to grips with as a country. And all peoples and all communities have got to be willing to tackle Islamophobia in the same way that we tackle homophobia, and the same way I think there's recognition across the UK that we've still got to do more to tackle gender-based crime. So we know we need to do more on Islamophobia. It's interesting, I think that we all need to do more as individuals to challenge Islamophobia on social media, and demanding that Twitter and Facebook take action to stop Islamophobic tweets is something that personally I think we should be doing more to demand that they take action. The Jewish community in particular have led calls to tackle anti-Semitic abuse of leading parliamentarians, for example, and others who are known to be Jewish. Perhaps the Muslim community should also be doing that on Twitter and with Facebook too, and challenging the likes of me and Chris to be part of that campaign.
Thank you very much. What's interesting is the Board of Deputies of Jews actually talked about tackling anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, so we all need to work together to solve this. Like Chris.
We've had a pretty comprehensive discussion on this. If the existing legislation is not working, then it needs to be looked at to see whether or why it's not working. If new legislation is required, then it should be brought forward. But it is really a matter for everyone to cooperate. Organisations such as this are in a position to place their views before the local elected parliament, whoever he, she may be, And I have cooperated with Gareth on lots of interesting topics over the years. And if this is a topic that you feel should be brought forward and should be the top of the agenda, then I'd be happy to cooperate with Gareth, irrespective of the roles that we may or may not hold after the 7th of May.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we have 25 minutes left. 25 minutes left, and we do want to cover foreign policy. So what I'm going to do is have 5 more minutes on this. I'm going to ask anyone to just put their statements together. Very short, very succinct, nothing longer than that. Let's start with brother in the middle. We're going to start with those who haven't asked one so far, and then we'll come to the others, if that's okay. And foreign policy will be coming later, so if you want to ask a question, remember.
To be fair, I don't think the Lib Dems have been part of this. It's more David Cameron's conservatives. I think Muslims are being, treated like the fifth column, I feel, with this government. We've seen Islamic charities being targeted, even well-respected Islamic charities who have been around for many, many years, like Islamic Relief. And then also recently they've taken up this non-violent extremism legislation, which clearly, it's against free speech, and it seems to be very much targeted at universities where students want to speak out against this government or typically, Israel policies or something like that. So I think we're just being targeted quite a lot.
Thank you. If we can have a couple more questions. Those who haven't asked, we're going to ask first. This individual here. Sorry, we'll go to Sister first, and we'll come back to you. Sister.
Assalamu alaikum. This is a question for Islamophobia as well as the foreign policy. Politicians will tell what they want to us to hear now, but one of these politicians who will become our MP for the future will bring us as Muslim community the Islamophobia and the policy, different policy, treating us equality and freedom of speech. What will they bring to us?
Thank you. Just want to know, this is recorded, it will be uploaded. All of their views have been typed up and it's online available, so we can and will hold them to account. Yes, question in the front here.
I think what we have to tackle in Islamophobia is the source, and one of the sources of Islamophobia are politicians. Because you'll hear every time they talk about Muslims, the politicians always demonize the community by saying, Islamic terrorism or Islamist terrorism, or the weird form of Islam, the twisted form of Islam. So the more ordinary people who do not understand about the religion see politicians equating, or the phrases they use are like Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism, Islamic this and Islamist this. So they assume that the source of all this is Islam, and therefore whatever, this is why you have attacks on the visible form of Islam, like women wearing the headscarf, the mosque, and so on. So I think it's about time that the politicians start changing the way they talk about Muslims. And I think the politicians are the source, one of the sources of Islamophobia.
Well, I try to be careful. My front bench role and as an ordinary MP, I try to be careful about how I talk about, for example, ISIS and the perpetrators of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and have defended on national media the Muslim community in the UK. But I recognise there is a challenge to continue to be careful in the language that we use as politicians. And what I'd say to the community here is that you should certainly, if I'm re-elected and you think I have not not been careful in the way that I have talked about, say, ISIS or acts of terrorism, then you should hold me up on it and challenge me on it, because I need to be careful about it. You're right, you get listened to, and people should challenge me if I get the language wrong. They should challenge other politicians too. But it serves to underline, doesn't it, the importance of a sort of cross-government strategy, I think, for tackling Islamophobia. And maybe, we need to make sure at local level that councillors get trained in how to talk about some of these issues in a way which doesn't reinforce stereotypes about the Muslim community. And maybe people like me also need to be made to think a bit more about the language that we use.
I think the point that came through was that politicians are seen as being a cause of Islamophobia by, dare I say it, in judicious statements that they make sometimes. I'd like to think that the two politicians here today are not the sort of people that would promote Islamophobia, but I suspect that there are others, certainly in Harrow and certainly in London, who certainly do stoke Islamophobia for their own particular ends. And it's not for me to comment what those ends are, but I think that it is very unfortunate that the people who are leading lights in the community do actually do this, and I think it's reprehensible that they do it.
So would you stand up against it? Working directly on this, Nigel Farage talked about Muslims being a fifth column and them being a group for the first time wanting to change who we are and what we are. When the politicians stood up against Nigel Farage, they stood up against him on his racism comments, but didn't speak up about his Islamophobic comments. So would you, if there was this done on a local level, would you stand up against him, and would you support or encourage your party leader to also speak out when Islamophobia is done at the national level?
I personally think that Nigel Farage and everything he stands for is very pale. If that happened here in Harrow, and that a statement was made by a UKIP representative, something to that effect, then I would be happy to challenge it. There's only been one Hustings meeting, to my knowledge, with a UKIP representative, and he didn't mention Islam, though he mentioned a lot of things which were fairly unacceptable, and which I would be more than happy to have taken those up with him or with his colleagues.
Gareth, same thing for you?
I think the best thing you can do with Nigel Farage is vote against him. And that's why you should vote, one of the reasons why you should vote Labour on May the 7th.
Thank you very much. Now, we have 15 minutes left. I do want to have, or 20 minutes left, so I would like to focus on foreign policy. We have, are there any burning questions from people who haven't spoken so far? Okay, one burning question, and then we're going to move on to foreign policy from the middle here. Yeah, that's fine.
I'm Nasser from Harrow Kuwaiti community. I represent the Kuwaiti community in Harrow. And as a community, we have many problems. And the main problems we have now is reunion issue. Some people, 50 families, stranded in Jordan, and we try to help them to come here to UK. So we would like to involve candidates now or after the election, and we want them to support us and involve to resolve this issue. So I want to know the degree of interest of each candidate.
Chris, let's start with you first.
Well, if you've got a burning issue, I'd be happy, if elected after the 7th of May, to meet you and take it further.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What I'd say to you, Nasser, is that we've already met, and I'm already trying to help in one or two of the cases of people you referred to who live in my constituency. I'm very happy to continue to work with you on that. I suppose what I'd say in response to Chris, if you'll forgive me for moving off the issue of statelessness, is that the reality in Harrow West is that you'll either have a Conservative MP or a Labour MP, and actually if you vote Liberal, you're making it easier for the Conservatives to get elected.
Not in the slightest.
That is actually an important question. You think that there's no Lord Oakeshott from the Liberal Democrats, associated with the Liberal Democrats and part of the Liberal Democrat Party, made a statement that tactical voting sometimes is very important. And in the recent election debates, the SNP leader made a similar statement about the importance of tactical voting as appropriate. What do you think that is your view that Liberal Democrats is the party to vote for, even if that means that those who you don't support may get in power?
No, I was asked by the Liberal Democrat Party nationally to stand for this seat in February. I put my name forward because I support the objectives of the Liberal Democrats by and large, and basically I believe that if you want a Liberal Democrat MP, you should vote for a Liberal Democrat MP. And I would certainly say that even although the result in Harrow West might point a particular way, there are lots of factors. There's UKIP are going to erode the vote, the Tory vote on the right. So yes, there are possibilities. Anything can happen. The election isn't over till the last vote is cast.
And given you made this statement yourself, Gareth, would you support other candidates in other areas who are, for example, Liberal Democrats, if they're going to be, and encourage people not to vote for Labour but to vote Liberal Democrats in those areas where it's a Tory-Lib Dem split? Given that you're, being consistent.
No, I wouldn't. I think that makes me inconsistent, and I'm happy to live with that criticism. I think you should vote Labour, but I think if you live in Harrow West, you've got to look at the results of recent elections, and it has always been an extremely close battle between Labour and the Conservatives, and that's the reality. Whether that's right or not is a different question, but that is the reality, and therefore, voting for Chris will let the Tories, who couldn't be bothered to turn up to this hustings, a better chance of getting elected.
Okay, we want to talk about foreign policy, if that's okay. If there are questions on other things, I'll sort of get many people, but anyone who, okay, if it's that bad, go for it.
Community issue though, with regard to the planning application support, as you all know, SLMCC is serving a growing community. We will be putting an application to develop an extension. Will you all support for an application?
Well, I'm not going to give you unconditional support now, so without knowing the details of the planning application. If it's a reasonable application, then of course I would. What I'd be willing to commit to is to sit down with the trustees of this mosque and to look at the proposal in detail with you. And sure, if it's a reasonable proposal, absolutely. I don't have any in principle objection as to why you shouldn't have a planning permission granted, but you've got to abide by the planning rules, and I want to sit down with you and look at the application to see if it did.
Thank you.
Yes. I would be happy to generally support the application subject to the normal planning rules. Those of us who are councillors know full well that an awful lot of there are rules and that applications don't go through necessarily. But I did support the planning application for the North Harrow Mosque about 4 years ago now, I think. And I actually backbenched and spoke in favour. I didn't have a vote, but I did speak in its favour.
Thank you. We're going to talk on foreign policy now. We have 15 minutes to talk about foreign policy. So we'll start with the person in the middle, Mohammed Sharif.
This is regarding Hannah's response to Israel on the questionnaire for MFM. To be honest, I'm absolutely outraged by her response. She said, "I would not support an embargo against anybody, i.e. Israel, who is legitimately defending themselves." Now let me put this into context. Israel in the summer killed 2,000 plus civilians, 501 of whom were children. They bombed UN schools and hospitals. They've killed 4 boys on a beach playing football. Now, Bob Blackman, her buddy in Harrow East, said very similar comments. He said, "There has not been a more urgent time to give Israel the support it needs, i.e. weapons." Now, these are outrageous comments for a country that does blatant crimes. For me, it shows the disproportionate influence of Zionist organizations on politicians. Now, my question to the 2 candidates here is, what's your view on Hannah and Bob's view on Israel? And what is your view on Israel and Palestine and the influence of Zionist organizations to politicians?
Yeah. Which I'm not going to comment on what the 2 Conservatives have said. I'm going to tell you what my view is instead. I mean, Ed Miliband made his comments, and Douglas Alexander, who's my boss, both made clear that they thought Israel's response to our summer was disproportionate. I have made it a priority since my appointment as Shadow Middle East Minister to champion the humanitarian needs of the people who are suffering in Gaza as a result of the scale of bombings. There is a huge job of work to do, it seems to me, to get the money into the different UN organisations, to get those homes rebuilt, to get water restored, sewage systems restored, and schools functioning again. That's the immediate priority. The long-term challenge is to get both sides to the negotiating table. And I recognise how many times we've almost been at the point where negotiations have taken place, only for those negotiations to break down. If we get into government, a challenge for a future Labour government is to work with all those who want to see a just solution in the Middle East, which in my view means that there has to be a Palestinian state side by side with an Israel with security. They're big concern. And that is going to require those who are committed to peace and committed to a 2-state solution, working very hard to bring the 2 sides together. It is an immensely difficult task, otherwise we would have secured a long-term peace deal passed. We have to try and create conditions of trust between the 2 sets of negotiators, and we also have to make sure that the different individual communities amongst the Palestinians and amongst those who are Palestinians but who don't live in the occupied territories can be involved in the discussions about what a just solution looks like. Because it can't just be about leaders just leading from the front. You have to make sure that the communities feel that they're part of the solution. And there will have to be compromises. And that means compromises on the Israeli side, and to be blunt, it will have to mean some compromises on the Palestinian side. And that will be extremely difficult. It will be extremely difficult for many people looking from the outside at what's going on. But the lesson from, for example, Northern Ireland, is that you do have to get both sides sat around the table, and you do have to get communities involved as well in understanding what is necessary to get a result.
So would you support an arms embargo, or is this a specific question?
Well, we've been very clear that we shouldn't sell arms to Israel if we can't have certainty that those arms aren't going to be used in conflict against the Palestinians. We have some of the strictest controls on arms in the world, and as a minister in the last government, I was part of bringing those controls in, and we need to make sure that those controls are being enforced and adhered to.
Thank you. Chris?
I don't propose to comment on the comments made by the Tory candidates, because I disagree with them utterly. I believe that Israel's response to the events of Gaza in last summer were utterly disproportionate, and I believe that we should move towards recognising Palestinian statehood. But as Gareth has explained, actually bringing a negotiation parties to the negotiating table is likely to be extremely problematic. After all, the problem's been going on for the past 67 years, give or take, and no one's reached any kind of solution so far.
Thank you. We have a strict deadline of 4:15, so we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions from people who haven't asked first. Start with the ladies' side and then come, and if there aren't, then we'll go to people who have asked. Any from the ladies' side? No. Okay, from the anyone who hasn't asked first? Who hasn't asked one? No. Okay, so people who have. So we'll start from here, and then we'll go there, and we may come here in the front, please. This will be the last round of questions.
Gareth, I just want to go back to your statement when you said we should not send arms to Israel if we don't have the assurity they will not be used against Palestinians. What assurity do you want? I mean, the mere fact that when you look at Israel, they've broken a number of UN resolutions. We know exactly what those arms are being used against. It's been very well articulated by the person there. I think what we need is more emphatic emphasis from the politicians between what is right and what is wrong. We don't need to be paddled just for the votes to say, yes, there should be this and there should be that. I think we need something more emphatic coming out from our politicians. And both of you mentioned earlier, you will speak from the heart, even if it means that you won't be towing the party line. I think this is the time to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very short, please.
Yeah, very short.
Very short.
Short thing is that when it comes to the Muslims, like in the Palestine or Kashmir, it takes 50, 60 or 70 years to discuss the problem. And when it comes to them, they go right away and bomb them. So why is there this thing going on? And people are just watching it.
Okay, I think we'll because of time, we have to stop there. So I'm just going to ask Gareth to answer those questions directly. We have one final one just on the slide there, someone who hasn't asked before, and then we'll just get Gareth's view and we can close out.
Different question, different topic. Basically, as you know, the road at the centre, along this our mosque is very congested, and I was wondering, if frequently the road is congested, so is it possible that we could have this road one way for traffic? This road is congested, and could also make it better for the residents.
Okay, I think we'll have to stop there, Gareth.
Okay, well, let me answer the gentleman there's question in the front row. I mean, one of the reasons why we have strict arms controls in the UK is to try and prevent British goods being used against or being used by to oppress particular communities. There is a concern that some of those rules were not respected, and we called for arms sales to be suspended until there had been those investigations. We've also been campaigning for the sort of rules that we have in the UK to be extended across Europe, and also similar rules to be championed internationally too. When people bring examples to us to suggest that British weapons have been used in defiance of those rules, then it's the job of politicians to make sure there's an investigation and, if necessary, arms sales stopped to that particular government. We have those rules. As I say, they're some of the strictest rules in the world, and we need to make sure that those rules are adhered to. On the point about the one-way system outside here, to be honest with you, sir, I think we, as someone who travelled the It's travelled both ways up the road. I'm loath to agree to. That's the 4:15 deadline coming in. I'm happy to look at it, but I think a conversation with the council and councillors is what's needed to make the judgment about whether a one-way system is appropriate or not.
What's your actual view?
What's my actual view? It's very congested at Friday prayers. It wasn't particularly congested this afternoon, if I'm honest with you, and I suspect it's not that congested at other times. So, as I say, I'm a bit sceptical, if I'm honest with you. But if the trustees make a case, very happy to sit down and look at it. Is the straight answer. It's not in my constituency. If the trustees would be willing to move the mosque,
there's an offer to fund another one.
As personally, I think you should. I'm very happy to look at it.
Okay. Chris.
Redraw the lines.
So Chris.
I think obviously the trustees need to discuss the matter and come forward with a proposal. They can discuss that with the traffic department, and that will take that further. Obviously, the only point I would make, and this is a general point, is that a one-way system, generally, it produces another problem somewhere else, and that's something that the trustees might have to take account of.
And the wider question on Palestine?
And the wider question on Palestine is, I think that maybe the time is right to make a statement, because the Palestinian statelet has been operating now for some years. I think it ought to be recognised in international law, because at the end of the day, I think that what Israel has done over the years to the Arab communities and the Palestinian community has generally been unacceptable. Basically, what happened in 1945 was, yes, the Jewish races of Europe, they were attacked, liquidated, but that wrong doesn't make their persecution of Palestinians today right.
With that, we will have to close today. We have to close
nobody
today.
answered about the Kashmir, because Gareth said that we have to ask the population, but nobody is asking the Kashmiri population.
I agree. We will be good to spend some more time with these candidates, but unfortunately we do have to stop today. We have to thank the both candidates for coming and answering the questions, so let's thank them with a round of applause.